So in this section of the part about eyes, we're going to look at this gentleman. Obviously he's a lot older than our previous subject, and because of that he's got lots of wrinkles around his eye area and a heaviness to his brow, which causes his eyebrows to be a lot closer to his eyelids. Pretty much we're going to treat the eyes in the similar way, though the catch lights are really important because they're going to affect the direction he's looking, and then more or less the outside area is just keeping it the same tones that we're using in the rest of the skin on his face. So just going to start in a similar way, taking a grey and just outlining his iris. It's a bit harder to tell on this chap what colour his eyes are because of the shadow involved. As you can see, I've printed out a larger photograph as well of his eye because it was so difficult to see from that. So hopefully that will be a useful reference as well as we go along. You'll notice in the line drawing that I've done, I haven't marked out every single wrinkle, but just the main defining ones. And just like before, I'm not going to put in any eyelashes until right at the end. I'm going to concentrate on getting these skin tones right. So working with creams and browns just to build up these folds. As you can see, he's got very wrinkly skin. Nothing to worry about drawing in wrinkles, it's just to be treated the same way as we looked at light and dark on defining the shape of the face. When we looked at dimples earlier on as well. Wrinkles are just smaller versions of the mounds that are like the cheek and the jaw. So if you treat each one as a little mini hill, so it starts off in a valley with dark, comes up to light and then goes back down into another valley. Again, you can see on this one that light area that surrounds the edge of the eye shape. So we're going to preserve that as a highlight. It won't be the white of the paper eventually, but we're just for now, because we're using a lighter tone to mark in the boundaries, I'm going to leave it white just now. Switch into a brown ochre. And you can afford to have a bit of a looser hand when shading and sketching these areas because of the texture of his eyebrows is right down near his eyelid. So you can just kind of rough it in a bit like this. It's the beauty of working on someone with more rugged skin. You don't have to be so careful about the shading blending one colour into another seamlessly, because obviously the person's got a lot of texture to their skin, so this sort of scribbling almost technique benefits the picture, but it's also easier to do, so it's a win-win. As long as you're keeping an eye on where the actual key defining areas are, so these points that I've marked in, things that would change if you got them in the wrong place would change the expression. That little highlight there on his eyelid, I'm going to try and preserve because that's the only thing really to bring that eye out of darkness, to give it shape. I'm just going to zone in as before on this catch light. Start to mark in the pupil. I'm going to look at this reference photograph as well and just see if I can see any of the little subtle patterns in his eyes. He's got quite distinctive markings actually in his iris. And there's a nice little thing appearing there. It's something I like to sometimes put in portraits if it's missing off the photograph. You see there's a tiny little reflection just on the front point of this bottom eyelid, and if you just make a little bit more of that than is evident, it can give an extra catch light to the eye, and it can just look really good in the finished portrait. Like I say, sometimes do either make more of one that's there or add one in. You see I'm not being particularly careful with these lines, they're just very scraggy and rugged lines to suggest his scraggy rugged skin. I'm taking purple. And you can see where this brow overhangs, there really are some very deep shadows under there. This eye is a very good example actually of the corners of the eye having reflections in them too. That's another thing where if it wasn't evident on the photograph, sometimes I would add them. Just because it helps to give the eye a wet appearance. You can see I'm just making kind of crisscross marks as well, just to suggest the texture of his skin again. I'll pay a bit more attention on this part here, this sort of under eye bag part, because it's a defining part for the shape of the eye. And I'm obviously going to try and preserve this, like I mentioned before, this highlight. But all the time my mark making is a lot more haphazard. It really doesn't detract from it at all, it adds to the texture. He's got quite bloodshot eyes, but I'm going to make a little bit less of that, I think. It's so dark in there you can't really tell. I'm going to use the blue like I did on the last lesson and just give the whites a blue tint first. When you look at any photograph of eyes, the whites, even though you know they're a white of an eye, are never going to be white on the actual photograph. And the thing we want to preserve as the whitest bit of the paper is the catchlight in the eye. So by making the whites appear more blue, we can highlight the catchlight better, just as a contrast. And also you've got to remember that the white of the eye is actually a sphere, so we need to help give that impression just by making the edges of the eye shaded as if we were shading in a ball shape. And start adding some of that grey and colour into the iris as well, keeping that little false highlight we made. And these radiating lines that I'm putting in, if you make them curved, they're going to also add to the impression of it being a three-dimensional shape. And taking a bit of that colour up into the folds and shadows just to keep it all nice and harmonious. Bring all the colours together. Just gives a better overall feel to your portrait. And switch to a reddish brown and do similar. Paying particular attention to these corners of the eyes. I'm going to try and put some highlights, and I'm going to just change these catch-light bits in the corners of the eyes slightly. On here it's like a double dot. I'm just going to make it into a little line. Just keeps it easier for you to define when it's such a small scale that we're drawing on. And start to edge up to that catch-light in the eye now. Just making sure all the time I'm happy with the positioning of it. I'm not colouring too heavily around it until I'm absolutely sure. Just because it's so important, its positioning in the whole look of the finished portrait. It's got some green tones in there as well, so I'm just going to go in with a green. And now I'm really getting right up to where I want that catch-light to be, really defining it now. And there's also here a cast shadow, cast by the eyelid and that brow. So just using some blues and greys to convey that. We have actually got another bit of a, not such a bright highlight, but a light area there. Just be mindful of that when I'm putting in this shader. And again, using the same colour to go in other areas just to tie it all together. It's a really good trick, that whatever area of the face you're working on, if you bring surrounding colours into the bit you're working on that you wouldn't automatically think would belong where you're putting them, it can just make a more harmonious feel to everything. I think the main thing is just don't be afraid to experiment as you're working. As long as you do it in a gradual way like this, you can pretty much, if it doesn't look right, you can erase it to an extent where you can get back to the previous layer and you won't have ruined anything. Down into the iris. So all the time, same as with the skin, you're just thinking about preserving areas of light that will make it stand out. Particularly in the eyes, it's just the more you can do to enhance the eyes, the better your portrait will be, just because, as we said before, it is one of the main points of eye contact for the viewer, is the eyes of the actual subject. When we're talking to people, when we're communicating every day, that's what we do. We look at other people's eyes and expressions. It's the same. If you want your portrait to be successful, you need to bring the eyes to life. Just almost lost that little light we put in before. I'm going to fetch it back. In the same way as building the pupil colour up, I'm just going to really use layers of red and blue and purple just to build up this dark, dark shadow under his eyelid. Just going to add in some of the surrounding skin tones just so I can build the colour properly. Because I've not done enough of the skin around, it's affecting the colour of this iris and I can't quite get it right. So just by putting in these surrounding tones, it's going to help me make those decisions about which colours to use in the actual eye. I'm going to work on this bit a bit more. It's a very red photograph actually. I'm going to stay clear of using too much red because otherwise it's going to make him look a bit sunburnt. I think it must have been taken in a warm light, like an evening light or something. I'm just going to sort of compensate for that, not overuse the red. Some more of these lines in here too. Just using some little curved lines to illustrate the direction that those folds are coming out of the page. Like I said, wrinkles are just little folds. They're just peaks and valleys. But doing the curved shading like that can just help to illustrate that. And you can actually see on this part of his eye, the white of the eye is actually in shadow more than the eyelid at the bottom here, so we need to get that so that this highlight is kept. We need to make the eye, the white of the eye, even darker. So don't be afraid if shadows are there of putting them in, because so that if you don't do, it'll start to look wrong. That like the 3D effect will be lost. You want this to be, the eyelids to be more prominent than the white of the eye. So we need to set the white back. Darken off this iris as well. So I'm looking now with my squinty eye, I can just see that the contrast needs to change. This iris colour needs to come in a lot darker. I'm still going to try and lighten it a bit from the photograph though, because I think a lot of the information about that eye is lost because it's such a dark photograph. So I'm going to keep it a little bit brighter than it is on the picture. And you can see as well that the contrast is not quite right because this catchlight isn't popping out yet. It's not the brightest thing there, and that's what we want it to look like. We want it to look like the brightest thing, so that it really makes the eye look glassy and wet and bright. Quite hard to define his eye colour, sort of hazily browny greeny blue. See there, I was just adding the purple touches to the eyes. It might not be something you would automatically think of doing, but because there's so much purple up here, it just somehow works to take it down there too. Yeah, I think you can start to see some of this sunkenness of his eye socket. Starting to get a bit of depth on there now. Still not happy with how white this white of the eye looks. I'm just going to take it down another tone. It's competing too much with that highlight. Adding a little bit of a yellow tone to the eyes. Quite often people's eyes have different colours in than you would expect as well. If you look closely at someone with a blue eye, they can quite often have a yellowy ring around the centre of the pupil. One of the reasons why I ask for so many reference photographs when I'm doing a portrait of somebody, aside from the main shot that I'm working from, I like to have as many photographs as I possibly can of eyes and hair, just so you can definitely get things like the colour accurate, and you can put them in even if the photograph you're working from has got them missing. You can add them in. Just helps to capture someone's likeness. This is a photograph where you can't actually see the gentleman's eyelashes, but like I said before in the previous example, if they're not apparent, then you can just add them in. Once I'm happy with this skin colour down here, I'm going to add in some eyelashes. So in preparation for that, I'm just going to make this a little bit of a darker area. And then just add on some individual ones, just a few. Don't want to make him too girly looking, too long of extended eyelashes, because he's quite a rugged, masculine chappie. But even a rugged masculine chappie has got some eyelashes, so we'll just put them in. Just little ones. As before, just make a couple crossover so it looks a bit more natural. Tiny touch of black. And I'd say we're almost there. So I hope you can see that there's been similarities between how we treated the baby's eye and the older gentleman's eye. Obviously the main difference is the surrounding skin texture and the shadows created by the overhanging brow. But there we have it, older gentleman's eye.